What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an update on Diablo 4, which just recently launched its Season 4 Loot Reborn yesterday from the time of this video, and while I am generally uninterested in many of its seasonal updates, this particular one happened to make a host of changes to the base game in terms of itemization and how things like that work that I thought were worth covering, as I do indeed love Diablo, even if the direction, let's say, the franchise has taken long term hasn't exactly been my cup of tea. But right at the beginning of the video, if you're curious about everything the actual seasonal content changes, it's honestly not that much. You can do some work with the Iron Wolves to fight off some new Helltide enemies that will grant you access to better and better items earlier on. And that's pretty much it. There's not a huge theme to the season otherwise, not a whole lot of new content that isn't just also in the base game. But I would say the core premise of this big update is simply simplifying a lot of how gear works and how it is upgraded and itemized, starting right away simply by reducing the affixes that roll on any given item by a significant margin. So essentially, whenever you find an item, it will do less overall. However, the affixes it does have will be a bit more powerful in general, and this is being done so that you can see at a glance whether or not this item should be an upgrade or not, and then you'll enhance the item further, adding affixes that you hopefully want via some of the new crafting systems, which are tempering and masterwork. But they didn't just reduce the amount of affixes that any given item will have, they also reduced what affixes in general can roll, and in particular they removed conditional affixes. So for instance, affixes that would cause you to deal damage to a non-injured enemy, as an example. That's been removed, and instead the only affixes you're going to see on items are now stuff like increases to your movement speed, max life, or single ranks to a skill. But as I mentioned, the more complicated stuff has been moved to a couple of crafting systems, so how does that work? Well, first, the Codex of Power has received a bit of an overhaul. This is basically where you would have your legendary affixes that you could then take to a vendor who could then add them onto other items, and you could also salvage legendary items for a consumable version of that legendary affix that you could put on other items as well. This has been changed to where salvaging these legendary items for those affixes just adds them to your Codex of Power now, and they can be upgraded in this manner as well. So right away, simply adjusting the legendary affix on a given item and how that works has been altered a little bit, but then we have the more interesting stuff via tempering and masterworks. So tempering is going to allow you to add affixes to an item via a somewhat chance-based system at the blacksmith. As you adventure now, you can find tempering manuals that are going to allow you to do this with crafting manuals, giving you access to a small number of affixes that correspond to a few different categories like offense, defense, mobility, etc. That will then, of course, improve the item with the given affix. Now, items have a tempering durability associated now, which is basically the number of times they can have an affix added to them, which should make them better pretty much right away. But then there's the secondary masterworking system. This is endgame crafting that also relies on their new pit system. But basically, masterworking allows you to upgrade the quality of the affixes on a given item, or essentially increasing their effectiveness at whatever it is they happen to do. Now, you're going to get the materials to masterwork things from the new system called the Pit of Artificers. Now, the Pit of Artificers is actually just the Rift system from Diablo 3 with a different name, as now, once you get to the endgame, you can start finding a new item called a rune shard that will allow you to activate an obelisk in town, which opens up a portal to some randomized dungeons that have a time limit associated with them, and you need to clear out so many enemies before fighting a boss, which drops a bunch of items and materials for you to use for masterworking, of course, and then unlocks further tiers of the pit as well. So again, just a reskin Diablo 3 Rift system with a different name, which was honestly a bit uninspired. Now, that's not the only thing they've simplified as well, though. Gems have been simplified. You'll find normal, flawless, and royal, and they've had some values adjusted, though overall, that part seems a little more like a quality of life change than anything else. But before we talk about the other major system that this update changed, I want to talk about my thoughts on these changes to itemization. So right away, I will say that taking the complexity away from the base drops of an item seems a little boring to me. And while I get that they were trying to shift the focus onto crafting and making those items what you want them to be, that can pose an issue when you say find an item, but it's not actually an upgrade until you get that item upgraded, which is a little bit boring and a little bit grindy, frankly, because now I found this item that in theory should be cool, but until I do a ton of different things to it, it's not going to actually be of much use to me. So yes, theoretically, it's a little easier to see whether or not something should be an upgrade when I pick it up to begin with, but with this system they have in place now, you also have to do about 20 different things to an item to get it to where you actually want it, which for someone like myself would de-incentivize me from going through the headache and materials needed to upgrade a lot of these items until I find something I actually want. So while I can understand the purpose and intent behind a lot of these changes, for somebody like myself, I find these a little bit on the opposite end of what I would prefer, because you're not simply adjusting the affixes and the power of them, looking to get a slightly better item than you initially found. These crafting systems are the gearing system, which means the chances of you actually just finding something really cool that you want to use without having to run it through this little system first is unlikely unless it's like an uber unique or something. So honestly, I would say the core of this update to itemization just simply isn't for me. But we're not done yet, a couple more things to go, because then we can talk about the Helltide. So Helltide, one of the in-game systems, when you get to the end of your journey, you might find yourself here. So with this update, whenever you're in Helltide fighting enemies, this generates a threat meter based off how many monsters you're destroying, as well as how many gifts in the Helltide you're opening. And as that threat meter goes up, the more you'll get ambushed and attacked, until you become Hellmarked, which will summon a special boss called the Hellborn, which embodies one of the player classes of D4. So basically they're pitting you against a really amped up player build, and if you kill them, you of course get a ton of rewards. And while that's the big change, there are a few others. They added a bunch of events and things to Helltide, and they've actually made it available earlier as well. So normally it would only be available in World Tier 3 and 4, but it should be available in Tier 1 and 2 now as well. And while that covers the core things I wanted to talk about and mention, the other thing here is, of course, the very, I would say, expected balance changes that come with any sort of live service type title. They've made sweeping changes to a lot of classes, mainly centered around making them a little more, I would say, flexible. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of that because, frankly, they're all going to be changed again at some point, because that's the nature of these live service balance changes. They will never stop tweaking these. It is nonetheless worth a mention that they changed a ton of stuff, from the duration of various skills to the exact amount of percentages associated with them. Mostly on the side of increases, though. So all in all, looking at this update for myself, I would say on one hand, I think there's a lot of welcome quality of life changes in there, things like the gyms, etc. That's not bad at all. I think even the changes to Helltide to make that system a little more interesting can be pretty cool, but a lot of, I would say, the core of what this update was about, which was reimagining the loot and how you go about acquiring and adjusting it, isn't for me personally. I can see why people in general might like this though, because again, in theory, it's a little bit simpler and it should be easier to target specific things via these crafting systems, but they attached those crafting systems to just a rehash of Diablo 3's Rift system. And that's to say nothing of the fact that they've essentially tied all of these changes that are base game changes to what is supposed to be a seasonal update, but the seasonal update is basically what I've just told you, but you also get to help the Iron Wolves out in Helltide, and I don't think that's a particularly compelling season either. So as it stands, I'm still waiting for the expansion to drop, and I'll definitely be covering that, but otherwise not really wild about these loot changes that they've made. But seeing how I already wasn't planning on playing much until the expansion dropped anyways, it's not really much of a loss to me. So that is pretty much going to do it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed this look at some of these new systems. If you did, don't forget to let me know how you feel about them down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.